Mrs. Albright laughed, a cold, dry sound that echoed in the silent mansion. "You think you can defy me, little one? Try telling your father about that dollar." Lily, barely 6, met her gaze, a tiny hand clutching a worn teddy bear. What she whispered next made the cleaner's smile vanish, replaced by a flicker of pure, unadulterated fear. The polished mahogany doors of the grand mansion swung open with a soft sigh as David stepped inside, the familiar weight of his brief absence lifting only marginally from his shoulders. The air, usually filled with the distant hum of the city, felt unusually still, an unsettling quiet clinging to the opulent furnishings. He had just returned from a whirlwind business trip, a necessary escape, he told himself, but one that always left an aching void in his chest, a stark reminder of the home that once pulsed with a different kind of warmth. He was a titan in the tech industry, a man who had built an empire from sheer will and brilliance. Yet his soul remained fractured, a mosaic of ambition and profound sorrow ever since the day his beloved wife had made her departure, leaving him with two precious fragments of her spirit, Lily and baby Leo. He tossed his keys onto the gleaming console table, the clink echoing too loudly in the silence. Where were the usual greetings, the excited patter of small feet? A knot of unease began to tighten in his stomach. He moved through the grand foyer, his expensive shoes making no sound on the imported marble, his gaze sweeping over the silent rooms. The house, designed for joyous family life, often felt like a mausoleum since his loss, a grand stage where he played the part of the successful, yet emotionally empty, widower. His children were his world, his only true anchors, and their absence now was a jarring chord in the quiet symphony of the house, a discordant note that grated against his already frayed nerves. A faint, muffled sound drifted from upstairs, a whimper that twisted his gut. It was Lily, his sweet, observant daughter, nearing her 6th birthday, whose bright eyes often held a wisdom beyond her years, a reflection of the deep understanding she carried about the changes in their lives. He quickened his pace, his heart hammering against his ribs, a premonition of dread chilling him to the bone. As he reached the landing, the sounds grew clearer, a low, insistent voice punctuated by a child's soft cries. It was Mrs. Albright, the housekeeper, her voice a low murmur laced with an unfamiliar edge. Foremost among them, Mrs. Albright had been a fixture in their home for years. Seemingly dedicated, her presence a constant, reassuring hum in the background. She had presented herself as the epitome of reliability, a pillar of support in their time of need. Especially after the arrival of Leo and his wife's subsequent departure, earning David's trust through her meticulous work and what he believed was genuine affection for his children. David paused at the door to Lily's room, the wood slightly ajar. Through the narrow gap, he saw Mrs. Albright, her back to him, her posture rigid, hovering over a small, trembling figure huddled on the rug. Lily was there, her small shoulders shaking, her face buried in her knees, a picture of utter vulnerability. Baby Leo's crib was in the corner, his tiny form blissfully asleep, unaware of the tension that crackled in the air, a fragile innocence preserved for the moment. The scene was a tableau of quiet despair, a stark contrast to the loving haven David believed he provided. He felt a surge of cold anger, then a wave of crushing guilt for his frequent absences, for letting his grief dictate his presence, for not seeing what was happening right under his own roof. "Please," Lily whimpered, her voice barely a whisper, yet it pierced David's heart with an agonizing sharpness. "Please, don't tell Daddy. I didn't mean to. I promise, Mrs." Albright turned slightly, her face a mask of practiced concern, but David caught a fleeting glimpse of something else in her eyes, a cold, calculating glint that sent a shiver down his spine, a flicker of something truly sinister. She knelt, her hand reaching out, not with comfort, but with a possessive grip on Lily's arm, her fingers digging in slightly. "You know what happens when you don't listen, don't you, little one? Daddy has important things to do, and he doesn't like distractions." Her voice, though low, carried an undercurrent of menace that was unmistakable, a veiled threat that made David's blood run cold. David's blood ran colder still. He had always seen Mrs. Albright as an extension of his family, a trusted confidant, someone who filled the gaps left by his own emotional unavailability, a steadfast presence in the chaotic aftermath of his wife's departure. Now he saw a different person entirely, a shadow lurking beneath the veneer of dedication, a predator in his own home. Lily looked up, her eyes wide and tear-filled, locking with his through the crack in the door, a silent plea for rescue. A gasp escaped her lips, a tiny, desperate sound that tore through the silence. "Daddy!" she cried out, scrambling towards him, her small arms reaching out, a plea for sanctuary etched into every line of her face, her entire being screaming for protection. "Daddy, protect me! Please, protect me!" Her words, raw and unfiltered, struck him like a physical blow, shattering the last vestiges of his complacency. The image of his daughter, terrified and begging for protection in her own home, was a searing brand on his soul. He had returned to find not just an alarming situation, but a betrayal far deeper than he could have ever imagined. A silent war being waged in the heart of his family, a darkness he was only just beginning to perceive. A primal roar tore from David's throat, a sound he hadn't known he possessed, shattering the fragile silence of the room. He burst through the door, his large frame a sudden formidable presence, sweeping Lily into his arms with a ferocity that surprised even himself. Her small body trembled against his, a fragile bird seeking refuge from a storm, and he held her tight, burying his face in her soft hair, inhaling the scent of her innocent fear mixed with the familiar sweetness of childhood. Mrs. Albright, caught utterly off guard, stumbled back, her carefully constructed mask of concern crumbling to reveal a fleeting flash of pure, unadulterated panic in her eyes, quickly replaced by a saccharine smile that didn't quite reach them. "Oh, Mr. Thorne, you're home early," she said, her voice a little too high, a little too saccharine, feigning surprise with an almost theatrical flourish, as if she had merely been comforting a child, not terrorizing one. Lily was just having a little moment. You know how children can be. David's gaze, usually distant and preoccupied, was now sharp, piercing through her practiced facade like a laser. He held Lily closer, shielding her small face from the woman's gaze, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. His wife's departure had left him adrift, a man of immense wealth but profound emotional poverty, navigating the vast, echoing corridors of his mansion and his life with a heavy heart, often seeking solace in the relentless pursuit of business, a distraction from the gnawing emptiness. He was a titan, yes, a visionary whose company shaped the digital landscape, but at home he was a widower haunted by a love lost too soon, a father struggling to connect, burdened by a guilt that festered beneath his polished exterior. He had thrown himself into work, believing that providing material comfort was enough, that his wealth could somehow cushion the blow of his absence, an illusion shattered by the raw, desperate plea of his daughter. Lily, his bright, sensitive girl, had always been a beacon, her laughter a melody that occasionally broke through the somber quiet of their home. She was her mother's mirror, possessing the same gentle spirit and an uncanny ability to perceive the unspoken, a trait that now filled David with a chilling dread. Baby Leo, still in his crib, oblivious to the storm brewing, was a tiny, innocent bundle, his very existence a testament to the love that had once filled these rooms, a love David now desperately sought to rekindle and protect. He had trusted Mrs. Albright implicitly, seeing her as a rock, a steady hand in the chaos of his grief. A woman who had seamlessly integrated herself into the rhythm of their lives, her meticulous attention to detail and seemingly boundless patience a balm to his fractured existence. He had seen her as a surrogate grandmother, a guardian, a necessary evil that allowed him to maintain his demanding career while ensuring his children were cared for. Now that trust lay in shards around his feet, Mrs. Albright, a woman in her late 50s, had cultivated an image of unwavering loyalty and quiet efficiency. Her dark, severe hair was always pulled back in a tight bun, her uniform impeccably pressed, her demeanor outwardly respectful, almost deferential. Yet beneath that veneer of subservience, a colder, more calculating mind churned. She had been with the family even before David's wife had made her departure, witnessing the rise of David's empire and the profound, almost debilitating grief that followed his loss. Her motives, David would later discover, were a tangled web of resentment and a simmering desire for what she felt she was owed. A twisted sense of entitlement born from years of perceived slights and a deep-seated envy of the wealth she served but could never possess. She saw David's emotional fragility not as a weakness to be pitied, but as an opportunity, a vast gaping hole into which she could pour her insidious manipulations, slowly, subtly, like poison seeping into the soil. He gently placed Lily down, his hand still resting protectively on her back, his eyes never leaving Mrs. Albright. His voice, usually calm and measured, was now a low rumble, edged with a dangerous tremor. "What precisely was going on here, Mrs. Albright?" he asked, the question hanging heavy in the air, a challenge rather than an inquiry. She smoothed her apron, her hands betraying a slight tremor, a tiny crack in her otherwise composed facade. "Nothing at all, Mr. Thorne. Just a small misunderstanding," she insisted, her voice regaining some of its composure. But the chill in David's gaze was unwavering, a silent promise of retribution. He felt the weight of his guilt pressing down on him, a crushing burden that had allowed this insidious darkness to creep into his home. He had been so consumed by his own sorrow, so lost in the labyrinth of his work, that he had failed to see the subtle shifts, the quiet cries for help, the insidious patterns of abuse that had been unfolding right under his nose. He vowed, in that moment, that this negligence, this blindness, would end. He would become the protector his children deserved, a fierce guardian against any shadow that dared to threaten their light. The first step, he knew, was to watch, to listen, to observe every movement, every word, every fleeting expression, for the truth was often hidden in the smallest details, waiting to be uncovered. He would start by making sure he was always there, a constant presence, a watchful eye, no longer allowing his grief to dictate his absence. The air in the mansion, once a sanctuary, now felt charged with an invisible tension, a silent battle being waged just beneath the surface of domestic tranquility. David, his senses now painfully alert, watched Mrs. Albright with a scrutiny he had never before afforded her. Observing the almost imperceptible shifts in her demeanor, the way her eyes, though seemingly placid, held a flicker of something calculating when she thought no one was looking. He noticed the sudden stiffness in Lily's small body whenever Mrs. Albright approached. The way her laughter, once free and unburdened, now seemed to catch in her throat, replaced by a cautious silence. His heart ached with a profound, knowing guilt, a heavy cloak he now wore constantly, regretting every missed moment, every business trip that had taken him away from the fragile hearts he was meant to protect. He had been a phantom in his own home, a provider of luxury, but absent in spirit, and the consequences of that absence were now starkly, terrifyingly clear. Over the next few days, the subtle signs began to coalesce into an undeniable pattern, each one a fresh wound to David's soul. He would notice faint, unexplained bruises on Lily's arms, small discolored patches she would instinctively try to hide, flinching slightly when he gently touched them, her eyes wide with a fear she couldn't articulate. When he asked Mrs. Albright about them, she would offer a calm, rehearsed explanation. A tumble down the stairs, a clumsy game, always delivered with an air of practiced concern, her voice soothing, yet utterly devoid of genuine warmth. He started to hear muffled sobs emanating from Lily's room late at night, sounds that would abruptly cease the moment he approached, replaced by a chilling silence. He would find the door to the children's playroom locked from the outside on occasion, Mrs. Albright explaining with a sigh that Lily needed a time-out for some imagined transgression, a punishment that felt disproportionate and cruel, especially for a child as gentle as his daughter. Mrs. Albright, meanwhile, maintained her facade with a chilling precision. When David was present, she was the picture of an attentive, devoted caregiver, her voice soft, her movements efficient, her every action designed to reinforce the image of unwavering loyalty. She would prepare elaborate meals, ensure the house was spotless, and speak of the children's well-being with an almost suffocating solicitousness. Yet, David began to catch glimpses of the other side, the subtle shift in her posture, the tightening of her lips, the almost imperceptible hardening of her gaze the moment his back was turned. He saw her snap at Lily for a spilled juice, her words sharp and laced with an icy disdain, only to transform into a saccharine smile when he entered the room, a chameleon of cruelty. The stark contrast was horrifying, a testament to her manipulative skill, and it solidified his growing conviction that his children were living under a silent tyranny. Driven by a desperate need for answers and a crushing weight of regret, David began his own quiet investigation, a clandestine operation within the walls of his own home. He started spending more time at home, canceling meetings, delegating tasks, his presence a constant unsettling shadow for Mrs. Albright. He observed her every interaction with the children, noting the forced cheerfulness, the subtle threats veiled as gentle corrections. His mind raced back through the years, searching for any missed clues, any red flags he had dismissed in his grief-induced fog. He remembered a small, intricately carved wooden box his wife had kept, a repository of her most cherished memories and thoughts, a place she often spoke of as holding the truths of her heart. He knew it contained letters, photographs, and perhaps, just perhaps, a message meant for him, a whisper from beyond that might guide him now. One evening, after the children were asleep and Mrs. Albright had retired to her quarters, David began his search. He moved through his wife's old study, a room he rarely entered, still too raw with memories. The scent of her perfume, faint but persistent, still clung to the air, a ghost of her presence. He found the box tucked away in a forgotten drawer, dusty but intact. His fingers trembled as he opened it, revealing a trove of handwritten letters, each one a precious fragment of their shared life. He carefully sifted through them, his heart aching with every word, until he found a letter dated just a few weeks before Lily's birth. A letter addressed to him, sealed with a small, delicate kiss. The paper felt fragile in his hands, a tangible link to a love he had almost lost sight of, a love that now demanded he fight for its legacy. The truth, he knew, lay hidden not just in the present, but in the echoes of the past, waiting to be unearthed. The delicate paper of his wife's letter felt cool against David's fingertips, a tangible echo of her presence in the quiet study. His eyes scanned the familiar script, each elegant curve of her handwriting stirring a profound ache in his chest, a testament to a love that had shaped his very being. The letter began with tender words of anticipation for Lily's arrival, a joyful outpouring of maternal love, but as he read on, a subtle shift in tone became evident. His wife, ever perceptive, had expressed a growing unease, a gnawing discomfort regarding Mrs. Albright. She had written of small, unsettling observations, discrepancies in household accounts that seemed minor at first glance, but accumulated into a pattern too consistent to be dismissed as mere oversight. There were notes about Mrs. Albright's unusual interest in their financial affairs, particularly the trust funds set up for the children, and a comment about a missing piece of jewelry subtly dismissed by the housekeeper as misplaced. "My dearest," she had penned, her concern palpable even across the years, "I worry about the shadows that gather when light is absent. Please, watch over our little ones with all the fierceness of your heart, for not all smiles are born of kindness." The words struck David with the force of a physical blow, a chilling confirmation of his darkest fears and a crushing realization of his own blindness. His wife had seen it, or sensed it, long before he had allowed himself to acknowledge the creeping darkness. The letter was not just a warning. It was a plea from beyond, a final act of protection for their children. He reread the passages concerning the financial irregularities, his sharp business mind immediately recognizing the hallmarks of calculated deceit. The missing jewelry, the slight but consistent overbilling for supplies, the almost imperceptible shifts in small cash allocations for household expenses, individually trivial, but collectively, they painted a portrait of methodical pilfering, a quiet erosion of their resources. His grief had made him vulnerable, his trust a wide-open door for someone as cunning as Mrs. Albright. The letter ignited a cold, righteous fury within him, a determination to not only protect his children from present harm, but to honor his wife's memory by exposing the truth she had so bravely hinted at. Armed with this newfound understanding, David's vigilance intensified, transforming into a methodical, almost scientific investigation. He was a tech titan, and he would use every tool at his disposal. Discreetly, he installed tiny, high-definition cameras in common areas, hidden within smoke detectors and decorative objects, their lenses capturing every movement, every interaction. He set up a secure network to monitor the household's digital footprint, scrutinizing financial transactions, cross-referencing receipts, and tracking Mrs. Albright's seemingly innocuous online activities. During the day, he maintained his distant demeanor, allowing Mrs. Albright to believe her charade was still intact, but his eyes missed nothing. He observed her as she meticulously tallied grocery lists, her lips occasionally moving in silent calculation, a flicker of satisfaction in her gaze when she thought no one was watching. He saw the way she handled the children's small belongings, a possessive grip that belied her outward gentleness, and the way she would sometimes pause at the threshold of his study, her eyes sweeping over the locked drawers, a thinly veiled curiosity that now seemed sinister. The nocturnal surveillance became his most potent weapon. Late at night, long after Mrs. Albright had retreated to her room, David would sit in the dim glow of his study, watching the recorded footage. He saw the subtle acts of cruelty. Mrs. Albright snatching a toy from Lily's hand with a sharp, whispered reprimand when she believed herself unobserved. The way she would ignore Leo's soft cries in his crib for minutes longer than necessary, her back turned, engrossed in her phone. The chilling incident where she deliberately framed Lily for taking $1 from her purse, then forced the trembling child to apologize, her voice laced with a condescending sweetness that curdled David's stomach. It was a slow, insidious torment, designed to break the children's spirit, to assert her dominance, and to further isolate them from their father. Each revelation was a fresh stab of pain, a stark reminder of his failure to see, to protect, to be truly present. As the evidence mounted, David also began the arduous, yet deeply rewarding, process of reconnecting with his children. He spent less time in his office, more time on the floor of the playroom, building towering block castles with Lily, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he helped her place the final turrets. He would sit for hours by Leo's crib, murmuring soft words, letting the baby grasp his finger, a warmth spreading through him that had been absent for too long. He started reading bedtime stories to Lily again, their old ritual, his voice a comforting balm in the quiet evenings. Lily, initially hesitant, slowly began to thaw, her small hand finding his more readily, her eyes losing some of their haunted look. One evening, as he tucked her in, she leaned in close, a whispered secret against his ear. "Daddy," Mrs. Albright said, "if I told you about the $1, I would be a bad girl and you wouldn't love me anymore." The confession, soft and fragile, nearly broke him. He held her tighter, pressing a kiss to her hair, his heart overflowing with a fierce, protective love. He promised her, his voice thick with emotion, that he would always love her, no matter what. and that she was the bravest, kindest girl he knew. He vowed to himself in that moment that he would not rest until every shadow was banished from their lives and every truth brought into the light. The mansion, once a sanctuary of quiet sorrow, now pulsed with a different kind of tension, a silent, psychological warfare playing out in its opulent halls. Mrs. Albright, though still outwardly composed, began to show the subtle cracks in her meticulously crafted facade. David's constant presence, his eyes like unblinking sentinels, seemed to prickle at her, forcing her to be perpetually on guard. He noticed her hands would clench almost imperceptibly when he entered a room unexpectedly, or how her voice, when addressing the children in his presence, would acquire an unnatural sweetness that grated on his nerves. Lily, sensing her father's unwavering attention, slowly began to shed her shell of fear, her small voice growing stronger, her laughter echoing more freely through the corridors, a precious sound that filled David with both joy and a renewed sense of urgency to dismantle the darkness that had shadowed them. He saw the way Mrs. Albright's gaze would linger on Lily, a flicker of resentment in her eyes. Whenever the girl sought her father's comfort, a clear indication that her manipulation was deeply rooted in a desire to control and isolate. One afternoon, as David worked from his study, his eyes glued to a discreet monitor displaying footage from the living room, he witnessed a chilling scene. Lily, absorbed in coloring, had accidentally dropped a crayon which rolled under a heavy armchair. Mrs. Albright, observing from the doorway, allowed a cruel smirk to play on her lips. When Lily struggled to retrieve it, the housekeeper simply watched, her arms crossed, offering no help, her silence a deliberate act of petty cruelty designed to make the child feel helpless. Only when Lily's small face crumpled did Mrs. Albright finally move, kicking the crayon further under the chair with a dismissive flick of her foot before turning away with a sigh of exasperation, muttering something David couldn't quite discern, but whose tone was unmistakably harsh. It was a small act, almost insignificant to an outsider, but to David, watching with the raw clarity of a father's love, it was a profound betrayal, a stark illustration of the insidious nature of her abuse, not always overt, but constantly chipping away at his daughter's spirit. David's investigation into the financial discrepancies grew more focused, guided by his wife's prescient warnings. He delved deeper into the household accounts, cross-referencing every receipt, every invoice, every bank statement. What he uncovered was a meticulously orchestrated scheme of embezzlement, small amounts siphoned off over years, cleverly disguised within legitimate expenses. The missing jewelry, his wife's favorite pearl necklace, which Mrs. Albright had dismissed as misplaced, was not merely gone but had been pawned. The transaction traced through a digital paper trail David painstakingly unearthed, but the most damning revelation came when he scrutinized the children's trust funds. His wife's letter had hinted at Mrs. Albright's unusual interest, and now David understood why. He discovered that a series of small, unauthorized withdrawals had been made from Lily's educational fund, disguised as investment fees. Routed through a complex web of shell accounts, each transaction bearing the subtle but undeniable digital fingerprint of Mrs. Albright's access. Her greed was not merely for petty cash. It extended to the very future of his children, a chilling testament to her audacious manipulation. The weight of this discovery settled heavily upon David's shoulders, a cold, hard truth that solidified his resolve. He felt a profound sense of anger, not just at Mrs. Albright's betrayal, but at his own prolonged blindness. His wife's wisdom, her quiet observations, had been a beacon he had failed to follow, lost in the fog of his own grief. He realized now that Mrs. Albright's resentment ran deeper than simple envy. It was a festering wound of entitlement, a belief that she deserved a share of the wealth she had served, a twisted form of justice in her own warped mind. She saw David's emotional fragility as a weakness to be exploited, his grief a convenient cloak under which she could operate her insidious schemes, believing herself untouchable. He also understood that her cruelty towards the children was not just about control, but a perverse expression of her frustration, a way to exert power over those she felt were undeserving of their inherited privilege. The subtle confrontations began to escalate, no longer just in David's mind, but in the charged atmosphere of the mansion. One evening, David deliberately left a small, inexpensive watch on a table in the living room, a test. He watched from his study as Mrs. Albright entered, her eyes immediately drawn to the glimmering object. She glanced around, convinced she was alone, then swiftly pocketed it, a practiced, almost casual motion. David later approached her, his voice deceptively calm. "Mrs. Albright, I seem to have misplaced my watch," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Have you seen it anywhere?" Her face remained impassive, a mask of feigned ignorance. "Oh, Mr. Thorne, I haven't seen a thing," she replied smoothly, her hands clasped in front of her, an air of innocent helpfulness. "Perhaps you left it in your study." The lie, delivered with such practiced ease, only hardened David's resolve. He simply nodded, a silent battle of wills playing out, a promise of impending reckoning hanging unspoken in the air. Meanwhile, the fragile bond between David and his children continued to mend, growing stronger with each passing day. Lily's nightmares began to recede, replaced by peaceful slumber, her small hand often seeking her father's in the quiet moments. She started sharing small, innocent stories about her day, her eyes sparkling with renewed trust, her fears slowly giving way to the comforting warmth of her father's presence. David would read to Leo, his deep voice a soothing lullaby, the baby often gurgling happily, reaching out to grasp his father's finger with surprising strength. The mansion slowly but surely began to shed its shroud of sorrow, filling instead with the gentle sounds of children's laughter and the growing warmth of a father's unconditional love, a palpable shift that Mrs. Albright could not ignore. She watched these interactions with a growing unease, her carefully constructed dominion over the children slowly eroding, replaced by the unbreakable bond of family, a force far more powerful than her insidious manipulations. The truth, like a persistent dawn, was slowly breaking, illuminating every dark corner of her deceit. The quiet tension that had permeated the mansion now began to hum with an almost unbearable intensity, a silent prelude to the storm David knew was inevitable. He had spent countless nights poring over the evidence, the cold, hard facts of Mrs. Albright's betrayal laid bare on his screen. The video footage, meticulously time-stamped, showed her insidious cruelty towards Lily, the snatched toys, the deliberate neglect of Leo, the cruel framing of his daughter for $1, all culminating in a pattern of emotional and psychological abuse that made his blood run cold. The financial records, cross-referenced and verified by his team of forensic accountants, painted an equally damning picture of systematic embezzlement, a quiet pilfering that had slowly drained resources meant for his children's future. The pawn shop receipt for his wife's pearl necklace, a cherished heirloom, was the final, irrefutable piece, a stark symbol of her greed and disrespect. He had compiled everything into a comprehensive dossier, a heavy binder filled with undeniable proof, each page a testament to her calculated deception. David knew he could not confront her alone, not without risking further harm to his children, and certainly not without the full weight of justice behind him. His grief had made him blind, but his love for Lily and Leo now made him fiercely resolute. He reached out to a trusted family lawyer, a woman known for her sharp intellect and compassionate approach to sensitive cases, especially those involving children. He arranged a discreet meeting away from the mansion, explaining the situation with a calm he barely felt, his voice betraying the deep-seated anger and pain beneath. He presented the dossier, watching as her expression shifted from professional skepticism to grave concern, then to a quiet, steely determination. The lawyer assured him that the evidence was overwhelming, more than sufficient to pursue both criminal charges for theft and abuse, and a civil suit for damages and the recovery of stolen funds. The legal process, she explained, would be thorough, but it would ensure that Mrs. Albright would face the full consequences of her actions. Meanwhile, Mrs. Albright's composure, once unshakable, was visibly fraying. David's unwavering presence, his newfound attentiveness to the children, and the subtle shift in the mansion's atmosphere were slowly chipping away at her carefully constructed facade. She found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, her eyes darting nervously whenever David entered a room. The children, especially Lily, no longer recoiled from him, but clung to his side, their small hands instinctively seeking his, their trust in him visibly renewed. This growing bond between father and children was a direct threat to her dominion, to the fragile ecosystem of control she had painstakingly built. She tried to reassert her authority with sharper words, with more pointed criticisms, but her power was waning, eclipsed by the protective aura David now exuded. Her saccharine smiles became more strained, her movements more abrupt, betraying the turmoil brewing beneath her surface. One evening, David overheard her on the phone in the kitchen, her voice low and hushed, laced with the desperation he had not heard before. She was speaking to someone about urgent funds and things falling apart, her tone hinting at a deeper financial entanglement, perhaps debts or other obligations that fueled her insatiable greed. He realized then that her motivations were not just rooted in resentment or a desire for a comfortable retirement. There was a pressing, immediate need, a dark secret that drove her relentless pursuit of wealth, amplifying her cruelty. This revelation, though not directly part of the children's abuse, added another layer to her deceit, further solidifying his resolve to expose her entirely. The mansion, once a place of quiet sorrow and insidious manipulation, was now becoming a battleground of wills, a stage set for the inevitable confrontation where truth would finally challenge deception. The lawyer advised David to maintain his composed demeanor, to give Mrs. Albright no indication that her carefully constructed world was about to collapse. This was perhaps the hardest part, pretending ignorance while his heart screamed for justice. Yet, for his children, he would play the part. He continued to observe, to document, to gather every last shred of proof. He spent his evenings not in his office, but in the children's rooms, reading them stories, holding them close, reassuring them with his presence. Lily, now almost completely free of her fear, would often lean her head against his shoulder, her small, trusting hand nestled in his. "Daddy," she would whisper, her voice soft and clear, "I love you so much." Those words, simple and pure, were the fuel that drove him, the ultimate reward for his silent battle. He knew the path ahead would be painful, but it was a path he would walk with unwavering courage, for the sake of the two innocent souls who depended on him, and for the memory of the love that had brought them into the world. The time for pretense, he knew, was almost over. The time for truth was rapidly approaching, a dawn that would banish the shadows forever. The dawn David had anticipated with a mix of dread and fierce determination finally arrived, painting the sky with hues of bruised purple and pale gold. He had spent the previous day in a series of intense meetings with his lawyer, Sarah Jenkins, a woman whose calm demeanor belied a formidable intellect and an unwavering commitment to justice. Together, they meticulously reviewed the dossier, each piece of evidence a chilling testament to Mrs. Albright's calculated malice. Sarah, her expression grim, confirmed that the case was watertight, not only for the financial embezzlement, but more importantly, for the psychological and emotional abuse inflicted upon Lily and Leo. She had outlined a strategy, a formal confrontation that would leave no room for Mrs. Albright's manipulative denials, ensuring that the full weight of the law would be brought to bear. David felt a cold knot of resolve tighten in his stomach. This was not about vengeance, but about restoring safety and peace to his children's lives, a sacred duty to his departed wife. The plan was set for the following morning. Sarah had arranged for a representative from Child Protective Services to be present, alongside a plainclothes police officer, ensuring the children's welfare was paramount and that the legal process would be initiated immediately. David had to maintain his facade of ignorance for one last night, a performance that gnawed at his soul, yet he understood its necessity. He spent that evening with Lily and Leo, reading them an extra story, holding them a little longer, imbuing every touch, every word with the boundless love he felt for them. Lily, sensing a shift in the air, a quiet undercurrent of change, nestled closer to him, her small hand clutching his shirt. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "will everything be okay?" He stroked her hair, his heart aching with the weight of the coming truth. "Yes, my darling," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion, "everything will be more than okay." He knew that for their sake, he had to be strong, to be their unyielding protector. Mrs. Albright, meanwhile, had become a shadow of her former self. The carefully constructed mask of subservience had begun to crack, revealing glimpses of the fear and desperation simmering beneath. David's unwavering presence, his renewed connection with the children, had stripped away her control, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. She had grown increasingly erratic, her movements sharper, her eyes constantly scanning the rooms as if searching for an unseen threat. Her once polished demeanor was now marred by a subtle tremor in her hands, a nervous habit of smoothing her hair, and a tendency to snap at minor inconveniences. She avoided David's gaze, her usual saccharine smiles replaced by tight, strained grimaces that barely concealed her agitation. The mansion, once her stage for manipulation, now felt like a cage closing in around her, its opulent walls reflecting her escalating paranoia. One afternoon, in a moment of sheer desperation, Mrs. Albright made a critical mistake. Believing David to be out of the house, she slipped into his study, her movements furtive and hurried. David, however, was observing her from a hidden camera feed on his tablet, his heart pounding in his chest. She began rifling through his desk drawers, her fingers flying over papers, searching for something, anything, that might give her an advantage, a way to escape the tightening net. Her eyes, wide with a frantic urgency, landed on a locked, antique wooden box that David kept on his desk, a sentimental piece from his wife. With a hairpin, she painstakingly picked the lock, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Inside, she found not money or incriminating documents, but a small, worn leather-bound journal, his wife's personal diary. Her eyes greedily scanned the pages, searching for any vulnerability, any secret she could exploit. The act was a profound invasion, a final, unconscionable violation of his private grief and his wife's memory. David watched, his jaw clenched, a cold, hard certainty settling within him. This final act of desecration solidified his resolve. There would be no mercy, only justice. The morning of the confrontation arrived, cloaked in a heavy, expectant silence. The mansion felt different, charged with an almost palpable tension. David had dressed with meticulous care, projecting an image of calm authority that belied the storm raging within him. He had ensured Lily and Leo were with a trusted neighbor. Unaware of the upheaval about to unfold, their innocent laughter echoing faintly in his mind as a reminder of his purpose. Sarah Jenkins arrived promptly, accompanied by the stern-faced police officer and the compassionate social worker, their presence lending a quiet gravity to the grand entrance hall. David met them, his gaze firm, a silent acknowledgment passing between them. He then instructed one of the remaining household staff to inform Mrs. Albright that he required her immediate presence in the living room for an important discussion. The air crackled with anticipation, every second stretching, preparing for the moment when the truth, long suppressed, would finally burst forth, shattering the carefully constructed edifice of lies and deceit. A soft knock on the living room door preceded Mrs. Albright's entrance, her usual composed demeanor faltering the moment her eyes swept across the unexpected assembly. Her practiced smile, the one she usually reserved for David, withered on her lips as she registered the presence of Sarah Jenkins, the stern-faced police officer, and the compassionate social worker, all seated with an air of quiet expectation. A flicker of something akin to panic crossed her features, quickly masked by a forced calm, though her hands instinctively clasped together, a telltale sign of her inner turmoil. She glanced at David, a question in her eyes that quickly turned to a subtle accusation, as if he were somehow responsible for this unwelcome intrusion into her carefully constructed world. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice a little higher than usual, a thin tremor betraying her carefully maintained facade. "Is everything quite all right? I wasn't expecting guests." David met her gaze, his expression unreadable, a wall of quiet resolve. "Please, Mrs. Albright, take a seat," he said, his voice calm, almost unnervingly so. "We have some matters to discuss." She hesitated, her eyes darting between the solemn faces, a dawning realization slowly creeping into her consciousness. The lavish living room, usually a testament to her meticulous care, now felt like a tribunal, every opulent detail amplifying the weight of the moment. She chose a chair opposite David, her back straight, her posture rigid, a fragile attempt to assert control in a situation rapidly slipping from her grasp. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the soft rustle of papers as Sarah Jenkins opened the comprehensive dossier David had prepared, its contents a damning testament to Mrs. Albright's years of deceit. Sarah Jenkins, her voice clear and measured, broke the silence, her words cutting through the tension like a finely honed blade. "Mrs. Albright," she began, "we are here today to discuss a series of serious allegations concerning your conduct while employed in Mr. Thorne's household." Her gaze was direct, unwavering, giving no quarter. "We have compiled extensive evidence of financial irregularities, including embezzlement from household accounts and unauthorized withdrawals from the children's trust funds." Mrs. Albright's face, initially pale, now flushed with a mixture of indignation and fear. "This is preposterous," she exclaimed, her voice rising, an edge of desperation creeping in. "I have served this family faithfully for years. These are baseless accusations." She looked to David, a silent plea for him to intervene, to dismiss this absurdity. But David remained impassive, his eyes fixed on her, a silent witness to her unraveling. Sarah continued, undeterred by the outburst, her tone softening slightly as she transitioned to the more grievous charges. "We also have significant evidence, Mrs. Albright, of emotional and psychological mistreatment of Lily and Leo." The dossier was slid across the polished table, open to a page displaying time-stamped images of Lily's tear-streaked face, a small, worn dollar bill clutched in her hand, followed by a detailed account of the incident and subsequent cruel treatment. The police officer shifted, his expression grim. The social worker leaned forward, her eyes filled with a quiet sorrow that seemed to penetrate Mrs. Albright's carefully constructed defenses. The mention of the children, the visual proof of her cruelty, struck a raw nerve. Her composure, already fragile, began to shatter. "No, this is a lie. It's all a misunderstanding." "Lily is a difficult child," she protested, her voice now shrill, her eyes darting wildly. She was always making up stories, trying to get attention. Her words were a desperate attempt to deflect, to twist the narrative, but the weight of the evidence, the silent, knowing gazes of those assembled, was overwhelming. David finally spoke, his voice low, filled with a quiet authority that cut through her frantic denials. "Mrs. Albright, we know about the pearl necklace," he said, his gaze unwavering, a cold, hard truth in his eyes. "We know about the pawn shop. We know about the diary." His words were like a series of hammer blows, each one shattering another piece of her carefully constructed world. The mention of his wife's diary, the one she had so furtively invaded, was the final, devastating strike. Mrs. Albright gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror that finally eclipsed her practiced indignation. A tremor ran through her entire body. The color drained from her face, leaving her ashen, her carefully styled hair suddenly looking disheveled, her immaculate uniform appearing rumpled. The carefully crafted mask of subservience and dedication fell away completely, revealing the raw, ugly truth of her desperation and malice. Her eyes, once so calculating, now held a haunted, cornered look, as if all the shadows she had cast were now closing in around her, ready to consume her entirely. She looked at David not with accusation, but with a dawning, horrifying realization that her elaborate scheme, her years of insidious manipulation, had finally, irrevocably, crumbled around her. The carefully constructed mask of Mrs. Albright had not merely shattered. It exploded into a torrent of raw, unbridled fury. Her eyes, once calculating, now blazed with a desperate cornered animal's rage, and a guttural cry tore from her throat. "You think you're so high and mighty, Mr. Thorne," she shrieked, her voice echoing through the opulent living room, laced with a venomous resentment that had festered beneath her subservient facade for years. "You were never here. You were too busy with your money, too lost in your grief. I did everything. I raised your children, I kept this house, and what did I get? Scraps. Always just scraps while you wallowed in your millions." Her words, though laced with a twisted self-pity, only served to confirm the depths of her malice, exposing a heart consumed by envy and a desperate need for control. She lunged forward, her hands reaching, but the police officer, who had anticipated her outburst, moved swiftly, interposing himself between her and David. The officer, his face grim, gently but firmly took Mrs. Albright by the arm. "Mrs. Albright," he stated, his voice calm but authoritative, "you are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you." Her struggles were brief, pathetic, as the reality of her situation finally, irrevocably, set in. As she was led away, her eyes, now brimming with tears of self-pity and defeat, met David's one last time, a silent, impotent curse passing between them. The social worker, her face etched with a quiet sorrow, assured David that the children would receive all necessary support and counseling, and Sarah Jenkins, the lawyer, began the intricate process of legal proceedings, ensuring that every stolen penny would be recovered and every act of cruelty accounted for. A profound, weary relief washed over David, but it was quickly replaced by a fierce resolve. The battle for justice was won, but the healing for his children had only just begun. 2 years later, the Grand Mansion, once a cold monument to grief and a stage for hidden cruelty, was transformed into a vibrant sanctuary of life and laughter. The echoes of sorrow had been replaced by the joyful shouts of Lily and Leo as they chased each other through the sun-drenched gardens, their faces alight with unburdened smiles. David, no longer the distant, grief-stricken millionaire, but a devoted, present father, knelt in the rich earth, teaching Lily how to plant vibrant marigolds, their small hands working together, a silent symphony of renewed connection. Leo, a robust and cheerful toddler, babbled happily in a nearby sandbox, his infectious giggles filling the air. David's heart, once a barren landscape, now bloomed with an unconditional love that was both his greatest strength and his most precious reward. The evenings were filled with the warmth of shared meals, the clinking of cutlery, and the easy flow of conversation. David would read to his children from thick, colorful storybooks, their small bodies nestled close, feeling safe and cherished. The scars of their past, though they would always be a part of their story, were slowly fading, replaced by the vibrant tapestry of a family rebuilt on the unshakable foundations of truth, courage, and unwavering affection. Mrs. Albright had faced the full consequences of her actions. her greed and malice leading her to a stark, isolated existence, her elaborate scheme having utterly failed. Justice, in its quiet, persistent way, had been served not just legally, but in the blossoming joy of two innocent children and the unwavering commitment of a father who had found his purpose in protecting them. The mansion, once cold and echoing, now hummed with the gentle rhythm of a family truly, deeply home. What would you sacrifice? What painful truths would you confront to protect an innocent child from the insidious shadows lurking within your own home? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. Remember, the insidious darkness of malice will always be punished. The quiet grace of goodness will always be rewarded. And true justice is built not on vengeance, but on unwavering truth, unyielding courage, and the boundless power of unconditional love.